the idea of it is sort of everyday habits that improve happiness and health and things like that. And obviously, your area and your field's dead interested. And I always sort of see on the things that get put on, and obviously I like following on LinkedIn and stuff like that. So I thought it'd be interesting because I think there's a lot of information about social media and things like that, and things that are different. I'm sure you'll explain all that for us, but sort of like to start at the beginning. It's normally the best place to start. So, how did you get into all of this? Like going right back to deciding you wanted to do, psychology and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of wasn't originally going to do psychology. It's a subject I kind of just picked because it kind of looked interesting. But yeah, the kind of cyber psychology kind of came around where I was picking my topic for my PhD. And so I just done kind of just, normal psychology up till then. And I'd been working as a graduate teaching assistant, and there was just somebody in the department who happened to be doing stuff on the psychology of video games, and it just looked really interesting. And I thought, oh, let's see what the kind of the literature is on this, what the research has been done, and they looked like there were loads of gaps and loads of interesting things to do. So I kind of just, again, kind of fell into this bigger field called cyber psychology, which I didn't realise kind of existed.
No, it's something that I'd never sort of heard across until you, to be fair. And then, it makes a lot of sense that there is something like that. So was it interest prior to, discovering it? Did you sort of like, I wonder what it could be, I wonder like this? Did you have like sort of itches to scratch in regards to like cyber psychology, even though you didn't know what it was? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I don't think I did at that point. No, it's more kind of academically driven. I mean, I'm just a geek, so always the case. And actually, it was from an academic perspective. Actually, there were sort of itches I think needed scratching around. There'd just been so much that just hadn't really been done. A lot of the stuff looked at the negative stuff on content of games and things, and there were so many things about the fact that gaming as a leisure activity is nice, and why shouldn't it have equivalent effects to other types of leisure activities. That just seemed like a perspective that nobody had really kind of done before, which seemed like a really obvious thing to do. And actually, I think my whole research really has kind of evolved into looking more broadly at different aspects of digital engagement, and that always seems to be the case. I seem to ask really obvious questions, but actually ones that don't seem to have been answered before, which is always really bizarre.
Do you think in sort of how complex psychology is, do you think that is maybe why them simple questions don't get asked sometimes?
Yeah, because usually you just have academics going, I want to ask the most intelligent question I can. But actually the reason, like the stuff I do now is on the psychology of emoji, and I've been doing that now for quite a few years. And actually it was from doing public engagement talks that helped me realise that actually it was the basic questions that I needed to answer. And actually, so the whole motivation for a big program of the research I'm doing now has been driven purely because somebody asked a really obvious but sensible question that I hadn't even thought of before. Like, are emoji actually emotional? It's like, well, that seems like a really obvious question, but actually has a very complex answer apparently. So I think there's a lot of merit to just engaging with the people who benefit from your research and who will just ask the questions that are important.
Talking about public speaking, you obviously did the TED Talk on things like that. How was that? Is that sort of a surreal invite, or how did that even come about?
I got invited to that, and I'm not sure whether somebody had nominated me. I never actually found out where the kind of invitation really kind of came from, so to speak. But so I almost nearly missed the original invite because it had gone into my junk folder on my email. And they actually followed up, thankfully, and that one for some reason hadn't gone in my junk folder, so that was lucky. So I nearly didn't do it, but that was surreal. I mean, it was kind of it's one of those sort of bucket list items that you kind of want to do, and having been invited and done it is wonderful. So it was great. One of the best things about the TED experience was that you're there and there's a sort of theme of the event. And this case was about, I can't even remember what the theme was, but it was people from lots of different disciplines, definitely not all academics as well. But it was almost, you felt a bit like family, that you all had this commonality of this thing you're interested in, and everybody obviously was talking about lots of different things. So it was nice just to kind of feel part of a different kind of family of people who you would normally ordinarily end up with. So it was nice.
I can imagine it was such a surreal experience. And how is that to process? Was it weird? Was there anything that, like, people get these big opportunities and sometimes they feel things like imposter syndrome and stuff like that? Did that ever like creep into your mind or anything?
Not on that one, because when you're invited to something like that, you kind of do feel a bit like I'm a VIP.
Yeah.
So maybe not in that particular case, but I mean, I think imposter syndrome is something that a lot of people do experience. Not, yeah, it's interesting in that case. Actually, reflecting back, I don't think I did really feel like an imposter, which is kind of interesting. And I don't know if it's because there was so much support actually for at the event. They did a lot of kind of coaching with you before. They kind of do. They kind of catch up with you before and help you know how to pitch it to start with. What's the opening line, because those first opening lines are really important. Then what's the kind of main message, what's the point that you're trying to make, so don't make a whole load of points, like what's the take home thing, and then how do you kind of end it. And that was really useful. So I think it was because it was such a supportive experience, it didn't really feel too scary.
And that's an insight that you would never get, because when you are a bit of a geek as well, so like I'll go and watch these things, and you imagine once you're on that big red circle, you sort of pull up, you're there, and then you're on. So it is interesting to obviously know that there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So I jumped forward there a little bit, just because it was a good segue. What, if you can remember back, when you was picking your degree and sort of your interest, why psychology? If you don't mind me asking.
No, not at all. I think picking it for a degree was because it's the subject I enjoyed most at A level. It's the one that I just found most intriguing, and I think for me it was really a nice subject because it kind of brought parts of my identity together, which sounds really corny, but so it was the science. The psychology is very much a science, even though some people will say it's not, but it is. So it's the science, and I love science. I always really enjoyed science at school. But also it's the kind of the people aspect and the communication. And there's not really ever been a subject area I've done before that's kind of brought those two things together. So I think doing it at A level started to help me realise I really enjoyed that. And that's what I've just found I've just enjoyed more and more in my career in psychology, is being able to do things like this, or do sort of science communication more generally, public engagement events, kind of creative dissemination things. It's really lovely because that kind of helps me do my kind of creative communication thing, but still be doing the science at the heart of it. So I think it just brings those things together, and that's really nice to do. That's where the kind of reward from the job comes from, doing things I just inherently enjoy doing.
And it just naturally became a passion sort of thing of what you enjoy. And it's interesting to mention there about merging almost social skills and academic skills, because there's a lot of probably misconception that with academic there isn't a lot of that sometimes. You know what I mean? It's like you one style or the other, and from everything you post and what I've read and like researched and that, it very much seems that with psychology it's almost vital to have them social skills.
Yeah, I mean, I think for any academic subject it is, because essentially the role of an academic is first of all about knowledge creation, but also about knowledge dissemination. It's all well and good having knowledge, but if you can't communicate it in a way that makes sense to people, whether that's students, whether that's general public, whatever, what's the point of doing? You've got these really important insights. So I'd say that's important to any discipline. I suppose in psychology, we tend to think of psychology as being practitioners and about helping people and things. And obviously, as an academic, that's not the kind of bread and butter of the role I do, but. So those social kind of skills would, I'd argue, apply to any kind of academic discipline.
And when working in a university, and you just mentioned there we talked about some of the misconceptions and stuff. When you have students coming in, do you find that you have to sort of break some of them down sometimes when they come in? Because I imagine they come in with this idea, and then this is where you sort of disseminate that information to them, but this is actually what it is.
There's lots of misconceptions about psychology and the sort of public at large, and people do kind of just think about psychology as, say, about practitioners, and a lot of it is people think it's about being a clinical psychologist and about mental health, and that's one a part of psychology, but actually psychology is a really, really broad topic area. And actually to do a degree in psychology, certainly in the UK, where we have accreditation from our accrediting body, you need to fulfill a whole curriculum of things, and that is looking at human thought and behaviour from lots of different perspectives, which I think is sometimes a struggle for people coming in, because they're doing all these very diverse modules and haven't quite in their head know how it all kind of fits together. And I think that starts to become more evident as you get through the course and you start to apply it to more specific issues. But yeah, I think early on in the course it's quite difficult to kind of piece together, well, what is this? What is human behaviour? And how do we explain it? Because there's so many different explanations. So yeah, there's a lot of breaking down, and part of it as well is about often particularly those who've come from A-level, often the curriculum in A-level isn't necessarily always representative of the most up-to-date evidence. So sometimes you have to kind of dispel some of the things that have been taught, which actually are a bit out of date now. So actually, I prefer it teaching students who haven't done psychology before. It's actually much easier to learn something from scratch than relearn something.
Yeah, they're not coming in with any preconceptions. Now they were sort of been solidified by being at college or something. Oh, that's interesting. I never thought of it like that.
And actually, you don't have to do a subject before in psychology to do psychology at university. So,
we mentioned misconceptions there, but before I've got a specific question that I want to ask. But I think before I ask that question, I'll have to ask another, which is for people that don't have maybe an idea of what cyber psychology is, could you give like a brief description or overview?
Yeah, definitely. So cyber psychology essentially is the psychology of technology use and online behaviour. So, I mean, that's really, really broad. That includes lots of different things. So it's, a scientific study of that experience. I tend to use the term digitally connected human experience, how we understand that, using cyber psychology. So that can apply to obviously lots of different things, whether it's the actual device use, the actual interactivity with a device, or whether it's the actual experiences you're afforded while you're engaging in virtual or digital worlds. That broadly is what cyber psychology is.
And I can imagine that it is so ever changing with just introduction of new technology like MetaQuest and things like that. I imagine that's an absolute insane one to dive into. We were talking about the misconceptions of like psychology. Is there any sort of perceived misconceptions with cyber psychology that you come across and that come to mind if I was to say that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's often when students come on, I teach a final year module in cyber psychology, and one of the first questions I ask them is, what do you think we're going to study on this module? Because that's first of all useful for me in knowing what people are actually interested in. A lot of people kind of say, I think it's going to be about cyberbullying and things. And so a lot of the focus tends to be on, it's going to be all the negative stuff.
Yeah.
Which is a part, a lot of the issues we look at in cyber psychology are about understanding how do we, understand harmful behaviour, and therefore how can we try and avoid it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of focus on the negative aspects, and why we might behave differently online in a more harmful way compared to offline. And a lot of misconceptions I think about talking about online as being a thing. It's sort of a singular thing when it's obviously not. That just means everything. You don't talk when you talk about online and offline identity. I mean, your offline identity is still multiple. We don't talk about it in that sense, but online we often do. And it's we have various guises in lots of different ways online. So it's the complexities around what the online space actually is, I think, tends to be a misconception.
And it does have a lot of like negative associations, social media, and rightly or wrongly, I think there's obviously aspects of it where it warrants that, but there's also aspects of it where it doesn't. I mean, how connected we are an instant that is. I mean, that's, if you think I can remember like when our phones were just like, you could text or do that. And even that's so connected. Like, my grandma can use WhatsApp now and then send me like immediately, and it's so changed. And like the beauty of that is you can be with people. But I read that article, well, the one that you put up the other week about that study. You was involved in that.
Is that the
one
meta-analysis one?
Yeah, and about not enough data to So I won't butcher it, but if you could tell people a little bit about that study, because I was so interested in that, because I was probably one of them people that had the misconception and thought what we'll get into was the case. But if you want to explain that study a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is it's not necessarily a misconception. No. So that study really was looking at meta-analysis, so basically looking at the evidence from a range of studies that have looked at how teenagers' use of social media relates to things like anxiety, depression, suicide ideation, the things that we tend to kind of be worried about for valid reasons. So we just basically looked at what the kind of evidence was about how those were related across those studies. So with a meta-analysis, you kind of get a kind of value of a an overall what we call effect size.
Yeah.
So how strong is that relationship, basically? So what we found actually is there's, those relationships are really very weak, and there's a lot of what we call noise in the way the research is done. And it's those things that actually explain bigger effects than the actual social media use. So if the study hasn't been perhaps gone through the most rigorous scientific practices and things like that. So the main real finding from that is that actually the quality of the evidence isn't really necessarily sufficient enough to make those claims. I'm always very, very clear. I'm not what some people would call an online harm denier. I very much am aware that harms can be caused, or certainly might be related to use of social media if it's used perhaps not in the best way. So I'm not dismissing the fact that the harms exist. What I'm saying is this study kind of suggests is the evidence, the scientific quality of evidence isn't sufficient enough to make those claims yet. Yeah. So that so it's not necessarily a misconception that those anxiety thing might be related to it, but
it seems a bit of maybe the wrong phrasing, but it seems a bit of a scapegoat sometimes, social media, to be sort of the focal point of all of our issues. And I don't think it could be, like you said, but not necessarily is either. So with that, and something that I'm interested in is obviously publishing studies and writing about them. And, a lot of people see these and a lot of people have like opposed ideas to that. How is that to put all this hard work into something and then someone be like, oh, that's wrong, or this, that, and the other? Like, you must have to build a certain sort of resilience towards that to be like, oh, just another one.
It's really useful to reflect on it, actually. And you do develop a thick skin by being an academic, definitely, and you shouldn't have to, but you kind of do. But sometimes, part of that having contradictory views can, in some cases, if it's done in the right way, be healthy to help you advance your thinking about an issue. It's useful having alternative perspectives. If it's done in a constructive way, I don't have a problem with that. It's just often it's not very constructive, and particularly in topics like social media. In fact, all the research I've generally been involved in has always been very polarised, and that's not healthy because people come at the subject from a kind of personal point of view. So it's very then difficult to then pick out, okay, well, we need to be clear on what the scientific integrity of this is, but people have very kind of personal views on it, where you've got such polarization and that just becomes a shouting match, basically. You can't find any middle ground, so that is really difficult. So I think, I've actually done workshops before on how to handle rejection in academia, because it's such a kind of a thing you have to be able to handle and to have strategies to do. So it doesn't really bother me anymore, to be honest. I've kind of again developed a thick skin from it. I say where it's constructive, I'm always very open to discussion and debates. But when you can see that people have, and there's very big discourse around social media and harms. I know I've not experienced it personally, but I know colleagues who are getting very personally attacked by certain people in the broader area because of the views they have, which is completely unacceptable, to be honest.
And I think it comes from a point of that. It goes back to what we were saying before about maybe having strong social skills and strong academic. So some people just probably transfix on this and that, and then don't have the skills to have a conversation. That must be so frustrating when someone like yourself who clearly does have that ability to sort of offer that rationale, and like you said, it does get turned down sometimes.
It's frustrating. Anyway, I'd say it's a minority of people who are like that. I feel very lucky. The community I work in cyber psychology generally actually is very, very supportive, and I really enjoy going to the conferences we have, because it's just like meeting up with mates. It's lovely, and you can have healthy conversations and collaborate with each other. So it's nice.
I think people like that insight again. You think about sort of an academic conference, and people probably think it's very serious and this, that, and the other, which I imagine it does have its capacity.
It depends which ones you go to.
Yeah, but I reckon it's nice to just realise it's very human, and sort of to disassociate that from, and it's good to know. It's sort of interesting from someone who has. I've worked at the university for a long time. I've never been to university, so I've sort of, when you meet different people and you get these insights, things, you break down these perceptions that you would normally get.
Yeah.
So it is interesting.
I'll
But
go along to any of the conferences that are any. So if as a member of staff, they'd be free for
oh
you to
yeah,
go to.
oh,
So
might be.
pop along
Yeah,
and see
I
what
could
it's
learn a
like.
thing or two. Yeah, some research for me.
Yeah, just to get an idea of what conferences are like.
Yeah.
They don't, certainly the ones at Edge Hill, we do conferences and events really well. So, they're good ones to go to.
I'll definitely check them out. Moving into obviously your background in cyber psychology and things like that. Is there anything that, or do you find it hard to maybe separate yourself from the work and the studies from when, say, you maybe using social media yourself? Do you like maybe think, oh, maybe I'm slipping down this aspect or that aspect, and does it take maybe a bit of the enjoyment out of it for you?
No, I don't think it's a useful thing to reflect on. No, I don't. When because I use social media quite a lot, I do use it for professional reasons on things like LinkedIn and stuff. But actually, if I'm using sort of my own use, I don't think I ever kind of feel or analyze my own behaviour or other people's or anything like that. I think the thing that is difficult is to sometimes disjoint your professional use of it and the personal use. So if you have an organisational account on your own device and you're getting notifications from that, sometimes it's the kind of work-life balance issue, but not in terms of more general if I'm using it just myself. I don't find it's too much of an issue actually, thankfully.
Yeah, and I like you mentioned there about, people have, because I do that, I've got, different accounts from things that I do, and it is very hard to disconnect. You get a message and you're like, oh, leave it, but then you're like, it burns into your mind, and you're like, oh, someone else isn't doing it, and then you get that. And is that something you found that people, is there any like insight or study into that people just, it's better to maybe not have things like that on personal devices?
It's interesting actually. I did look into this because as somebody who has in the past run a lot of different organisational accounts, obviously from a personal point of view, I kind of just invested in it. But there's actually very little on professional or whatever you might call it use of social media and how that's managed at a kind of organisational level. There's more wider stuff in sort of organisational psychology about kind of techno stress and things like that, but that's not quite what this is. And this is where it's a challenge, where you look at the kind of evidence and research about social media. It talks about, you need to restrict your social media use. That tends to be the take-home advice that's given, which I'd argue is perhaps could be a bit more sophisticated than that, but anyway. But it's like, well, that's all well and good, but if part of your job role is you're running an organization, you can't just stop working because you've exceeded your screen time limits. So it's like, how does that intersect with professional use of social media?
Because I had a content creator on, a friend of mine, and she is like, she does it for food companies and things like that, and she was saying one of the biggest things she struggles with is not finding herself just working. Like, even when she's on the personal accounts, she'll still find herself looking at like, competitors or other brands in which she can do, and it's having a lot of maybe self-awareness. And I used to say mindfulness, but I was actually talking to someone that was like much more critical thinking, I think, than mindfulness. But like, have that thinking of being like, am I doing this for the right reasons, or sort of just in that void? Because for my personal experience, it is very hard to just find yourself doom scrolling in it. But like, you're just there, and you're like, shit, 25 minutes has gone and I've done nothing productive. I think there's a lot of pressure to always feel productive, and like, oh, you shouldn't be wasting your time on social media. But you mentioned before about gaming and social media. I love gaming. Like, Nintendo Switch is probably my bag, but like it's a leisure thing as well, isn't it? And like, is the studies to sort of prove that there is benefit to sort of winding down, and it's not always this big bad thing of you just like killing your brain cells. Because that's what it feels like we're being told. It's like, this is a worst case scenario.
I mean, in terms of the social media stuff, it doesn't tend to look at it as a kind of leisurely thing. I mean, the problem with the social media is you can do so many different things on there. So lots of people use it to watch videos, and you could say, well, that's an entertainment function. And things like TikTok's a really interesting one, because a lot of younger people, for example, aren't sort of necessarily conceptualizing it as social media. It's more that's how I watch my TV shows. So, I mean, that you could imagine, well, that would have obvious kind of benefits if you enjoy watching a particular show and you can watch it via this social media, then why would it not have the same benefits as if you're watching it via Netflix on a TV? Yeah, so it becomes quite complicated when sort of framing it as a kind of leisure thing, because essentially you could do so many. And actually, again, if you use it for organisational purposes, if you're using it then, it's not going to be for leisure. So you're using it for work. So it's a really complex kind of issue to sort of look at when you talk about social media, because it is so complex as a thing, and different platforms are different and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's difficult to kind of pin down what the actual benefits are, because the activities and behaviours you do are different. So actually, some of the research we've done has looked at quantifying different types of behaviours, so more sort of interactive behaviours, where you kind of actually bidirectionally communicating with somebody versus more passive, so more observing. And we find that there's differences in people's perception of their sort of feeling of social connectedness to social media as a result of different behaviours. So I'd always be, an advocate for understanding what the complexities of the behaviours of social media are, rather than just use it less.
Because you mentioned the gaming before as well, and I remember growing up, like certain games, they were like, do not let people play these. These are like making them violent and aggressive. And I imagine there is cases where that's been proven, but yeah, gaming was always sort of like something to have, and I agree it probably is right to do it in smaller quantities, but now it's just changed so much. Like I have cousins and family members who are a lot like younger, and as opposed to gaming a little and like playing outdoors and doing this a lot, it's very vice versa. And is there any sort of reason as to why them trends would happen when you've been looking into gaming over the years, and why they've sort of developed into this, like the main focal of what younger people do?
I mean, there have been discussions about this more generally, about more general sort of online kind of engagement and things. And there are these sort of wider issues and lots of kind of conversations around, parental practices around not feeling it's safe for their children to go out. So I think it's, when you're having these discussions, it's sort of looking at this in the kind of wider context of all the other kind of issues that are happening. So yes, there are maybe more engaging or immersive things that the online world is driving people to want to engage in. So that's one aspect. But I think a lot of it, if you think about younger children, is to do with just more general parental decision making and their need to want to kind of protect children, which is obviously very valid. So yeah, I think there's a range of different sorts of trends that kind of have interacted a little bit there. But yeah,
it's scary when you see like a 3-year-old use an iPad better than I can, and I'm like, that is
like, wow.
My niece is like, I'm like, wow, that is insane. Cause I did, but even like years ago, I remember I did some like volunteer work in a primary school, and I was working in reception, and like they just had the class iPad and like, look at this, what I've learned today, and I was like taking notes like as well. That's how you do that, and like this is from like 5-year-olds. But you mentioned, not on the last bit we talked about this one before, but it just popped into my mind about, with the trends and how sort of people talk and present themselves online. Now, obviously, the emoji stuff and what you did your TED talk on was quite heavily about that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And like using them passively and using them in conversation. Do you mind sort of diving into that a little bit? I watched it and like, not just like blowing smoke, but like it was interesting and something that I'd never even thought about before. So
yeah, I mean, that was about the kind of emoji research. I've sort of moved on and sort of looking at different things now, but that was all about how you can identify personality trait from emoji. So are there particular things about certain personality traits that might be related to people using certain emoji? So I think the broader kind of area this fits under is what might be called digital traces. So there's huge sort of areas of research that look at how you can understand people and what you can detect about humans and characteristics from different types of online behaviours. So whether it's even something as subtle as how many times you've just opened your phone and checked it and things. There's a really sort of interesting area of research, or sort of area it's sort of in cyber psychology, but maybe just psychological science more generally about digital traces. Yeah, it's really kind of intriguing to think about, well, what can you actually tell about people from their online behaviour? And emoji was the one thing we were focusing on for that, and showing, how, if you use sort of smiley emoji this was particularly in the context of Facebook, because most people use Facebook then, was that it sort of signalled certain different types of personality traits rather than using other emojis. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
And do the different you mentioned that like people were predominantly using Facebook, and that's probably not the case now for most people. It's probably more like Instagram and TikTok, isn't it? And I don't know if you do this sorry, but like, have the trends changed with the platforms changing? Have they changed maybe slight meanings and how that perception comes across just because of the different platform?
I mean, very likely. It's difficult to know really, and part of the problem of actually from a research point of view, doing research on these things is if the platforms change and the functionalities change, then inherently behaviour is going to change. Yeah. I actually have a colleague who, when she was doing her PhD, her supervisors advised that rather than just focusing on one platform, she did more generally social media in case one of the platforms just went bust during the PhD. And I have somebody else who was in the middle of doing a PhD study on analysing kind of content on social media profiles based on people consenting to her kind of observing that behaviour. And what happened is Facebook decided to switch their interface midway through that. So that destroyed her entire PhD study. So, there are those actual real challenges of this. Yeah. And if you're doing longitudinal research, so over, several years, if the platform changes in that time, you then, what do you do? So, it's, from a research point of view, it can be challenging, but also just from an understanding of the phenomena generally, behaviour is going to evolve, it is going to change, because inherently the platforms change.
And it's so much in its infancy. Like, it's still a relatively new thing. I think, I can't remember the year exactly, but was it like 2009 that Facebook put the app onto the phone? Like,
will have been around
yeah. So, and that's probably the game changers when it went from desktop to just this extension of us, because that's essentially what we know. Like, I'm wearing a wearable, most people have them, and just having that sort of technology is an extension of our being now.
No, I think it's a really good point. Actually, the kind of behaviours we look at now actually are inherently different, and actually even scrolling, that is purely a behaviour that exists because of the fact we tablets and phones. Scrolling wouldn't be even a term we used on the desktop. So there's definitely interaction with understanding social media behaviour in relation to how we actually access it, the device level type stuff. So that's a whole kind of issue in itself. It brings another level of complexity.
I mean, talk about extension. I didn't even pick my iPad out then. I was like, oh, we've got watches. I forgot I was holding my iPad. That's how much of an extension it is of me. And I was like, and then you was like, iPad. I was like, shit, that's in my hand, that. But it is crazy, and sort of, especially with the wearables. I don't know if there's any sort of, well, I imagine there is, but studies and things about just how much more in depth they're getting. Like, especially fitness wearables.
Yes.
I had a Whoop. I don't know if you've come across the Whoops before. No. So they're a faceless band. But they tell you about like your HRV, your skin temperature, how much you sleep, and it tracks everything. Your first 30 days, it's pretty useless because it's collating all your data. It preempts you getting sick. It's insane. It's all about strain and recovery and activity.
Oh, okay.
But I just found myself becoming, like, living my life by it. Like, because it was saying, like, your skin temperature's hot, you might be getting sick. And I'd be like, I think I'm getting sick. And, like, I reckon in the past, if I'd never seen that metric, I would have never thought I'm getting sick.
That's really fascinating.
I've
heard of that. That's really
it's Whoop. But, the insight and the data, like, I love all that, like the data and stuff, and that's why I wear them. But it is truly, like, incredible. Check it out. I'm sure you'll. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. But is there anything to do with, like I've just said, for me, I feel like sometimes I can live my life by them. Is there evidence of that, or any studies that would say that people do that?
Not to my awareness. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but I'm just not aware of. I know there's the stuff that looks at the idea of self-extension through technology and things like that. Lots of the stuff on the more digital wearable stuff tends to be in relation to looking at how it relates to physical activity. I'm not sure about that though. I think that's really intriguing. I think it's interesting because you can almost, because what we're interested in psychology is about how do we explain and predict behaviour.
Yeah.
And that's almost like you can predict your own behaviour, and how does that change your behaviour result? I mean, that's fascinating in itself.
But it literally tells you things like you can have a journal on it, and you can go through sort of daily actions, very personal or very not personal, like what it asks you. And if you log it for long enough, it says it will detect what has a positive or a negative impact in your recovery. So say like I take supplements. So say I was taking turmeric for a week. After that week, it would then say how much of a positive or a negative impact that has on my recovery.
Interesting.
Yeah, and like you don't know how sort of.
And you couldn't necessarily link those things together. It could be anything that's
fed into that. But I mean, and that's why I stopped wearing it, because I was like, I paid for it, so I was like, I'm going to use it for the time which I paid it. But toward the end, I was a bit like, mad. I was sort of like, am I feeling these things? Because I didn't feel like certain ways when I was taking things, but then it's placebo, isn't it? But then toward the end, when I was seeing this data, you sort of take it as gospel without having any sort of critical thinking about it. I was a bit like, is this what's telling me, or am I actually feeling it?
That's really interesting. I mean, you could imagine actually that could for some people be quite dangerous if they're kind of ruling their whole life by that, as you say, if they're not kind of appraising it. And kind of, it's good that you kind of recognise that actually. But yeah, that's. But
really I probably didn't for a long, like a long period of that time. It's probably when it comes to the end, then I was justified spending another couple of £100 on it. I was like, well, actually, maybe that factor came in. But you see it with steps as well, don't you? People like obsessed with steps, like that metric and things. And it's similar, isn't it? It sort of becomes a case of like, is it positive or is it sort of negative? Which I've never sort of sat down and thought about. I know people still like my age, like not wearing a watch because it'll just ruin my life. Like I'll be like, got to do 10,000 steps today, and I'll feel bad if I've only done 8. And I'm definitely like that.
No, I mean it's good that you kind of recognise that and think I'm going to kind of send myself down that. But yeah, I mean I think that's the way the world we live in, isn't it? Data and digital is just such a core part of us personally in terms of the data we collect and how we kind of regulate our lives around it, but also more regulation more generally on the societal level. Data just helps us understand, personalising experiences. Algorithms on Netflix tell us, what the things are that we want, what we want to watch. And, data, I mean, that kind of data is really valuable in many ways. I mean, obviously it can be used against us, but actually it enables us to have these more personalised experiences, which we'd never, necessarily always have. It would have been mass consumption, media, etc. So that is intriguing itself about the intersection of the digital has enabled data kind of led ways to mean that we have more personalised user experiences, and not just a user experience of the world.
Definitely,
so it's interesting.
And how important is it for you to keep up with the sort of development and evolution of technology? And like, is it hard to do? Because obviously we've mentioned a few things like the Whoop Bands, the MetaQuest, all that sort of stuff. They just appear. And like what you're saying about social media, you wake up one morning like, is this Instagram, or is it a completely different app that they've just called Instagram? How much time do you have to sort of put in, or is it just sort of roll with the punches and wait for it to like whack-a-mole just pop up and deal with it then?
I think that tends to be my strategy actually. I mean, I think for the things I'm researching now, it's possibly not as important with the emoji stuff. Emoji can change a bit based on platforms, but actually inherently the question I'm asking wouldn't fundamentally change because of technology developments that much. Depends on the type of question you're asking. I mean, it is useful keeping up to date. When having conversations like this, then can sound like I know what I'm talking about. But even today, I'd never heard of Whoop before. But what I find really, really useful is having a final year module where I have students coming in, because they open my eyes to everything that's new, everything that's trending, and that's actually really useful. So I learn a lot from them, to be honest. And they bring their own experiences into the module about how, and obviously we link it back to all the academic stuff, but I learn a lot through having those conversations. So that serves a really useful purpose, to be honest.
And working in sort of the university myself with the ever-changing demographic. I mean, it's the same demographic, but I think, you know what I mean? Like every 3 years, it's sort of it's slightly different. And then, you know, you look at 10 years ago, it's completely different to now. And I imagine that is so beneficial because they sort of keep us in the loop with what is current for what they want. So like me and probably yourself, like you said, we'll just go out and leave this sort of echo chamber of what it is and just do what we've always done. But yeah, I never actually thought about that perspective of the students coming in, sort of keeping you up to date.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, in that module particularly, because it's to do with the actual subject content. But yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, we talk a lot about research informed teaching, and I mean that module's great because I can teach everything I know about, which is great. But actually, there's a kind of student enriched experience for me from having them in that module because I learn about stuff from that. And again, sometimes that helps me understand, well, what are the questions that we should be asking? So there's a really nice cycle that happens there through that kind of from teaching on a module.
And I imagine it stops, not putting words in your mouth, sorry, but I imagine it keeps it from not maybe getting stagnant. Definitely. It keeps it ever changing and keeps that sort of that passion going.
Definitely. And that's why I love doing that module because it's great.
So keeping on sort of track with cyber psychology, and you know, when you do this module and stuff, what are some of the things that do any of the students pick up on the areas that it can better them and make them understand themselves better by having a better relationship or a better understanding of cyber psychology?
There's probably been some examples of that. I mean, we do often end up in conversations about our own habits around technology and the types of things we see. And one of the activities I get them to do is almost like track across the week, you know, what their engagement with different types of technology are and get them to kind of reflect on that. And the main reason I get them to reflect on that is from the perspective of sort of like the internet addiction stuff. So it's like, well, okay, if you've used all these different types of technologies, then and you're using it for all these different reasons and purposes, then some of them are functional. So that's not addiction. The reason you're using it is for a particular purpose. So it's kind of part of a kind of learning point from them. But so that in itself helps them reflect a bit on what types of things they're using and why. And I think it's going back to what you said before about that self-awareness. Why am I using it? What function is it serving? Am I more goal directed? Am I using it for a particular reason to get something at the end of it? Or am I just using it because I'm bored? I have quite a few dissertation projects this year looking at the kind of mood drivers of using different types of platforms on social media. So, you know, to understand a bit more about what are those sort of affective or emotional states that might drive different types of behaviours on social media. And I think that awareness of that is really useful. Again, that self-checking in process.
It's interesting you mentioned about sending them away and looking, because a while ago I did the thing about, you know, where you do like your report, your usage report on your phone. Terrified me. I was like, oh my God. And like anyone who's ever done that, do that, because it's mental. And like I'm not like probably great or bad is the wrong terminology, but I'm someone who can find myself lost in my digital like devices and things like that. But I would never say I was sort of at the level in which I saw, and I was like, wow, that was such an eye opener. You know, you have these conversations with them and that, and they go away and they do this, and what are sort of, you don't have to give loads of examples, but what are sort of the common positives and negatives that they come back with of the usage with, say, social media or technology?
Yeah, I mean, something they come back with is about their kind of laptop use and using the internet for accessing things like Google Scholar and articles. They're actually reflecting on the kind of work they've been doing, which obviously from my point of view is very positive. So, you know, it gets them to reflect on actually there's differences in work and functional use and leisurely use and all this kind of stuff. I mean, some of the things, you know, they talk about the fact that might have used sort of well-being apps and things like that. I used, I can't remember the particular one that a lot of them talk about, but they say actually I use that X amount of times a day and that really helps me. But, you know, that's logged on my kind of metrics, but actually. So part of it is then, okay, if you're looking at your metrics, break it down with the different types of apps that you've looked at and how many on each. And obviously TikTok ends up usually being the one that people use the most. Actually, one of the activities I do when we have school visits coming in doing taster sessions is get them to sort of guess, you know, or estimate how much have you used social media this week, which nobody can do because it's impossible to quantify. But when they say, okay, well, if you've got your phone, have a look now, and the teachers are often disgusted about how long they spend on TikTok. I think the worst was like, you know, 8 hours a day, like for one. born student, and the teacher was like, "No, you send it 8 times a day." So anyway, it creates interesting conversations, and then you get down to the root of it about, okay, well, why are you spending that much time on there, and what are the things that you're watching, and you can then dig down a bit. Then based on those experiences, it helps you then analyze a little bit the kind of what you're engaging in, how you're engaging, and why, and it then brings out more interesting questions, I think. So, yeah.
Just talking about TikTok, just because this question's come to mind. TikTok has to be one of the most trailblazing like social media platforms ever. It just appeared and has never left.
Yeah.
But it's so someone who sort of with the podcast and the book and everything like that, I use social media and try and keep people engaged. Try my best. But TikTok has changed everything because of like the terminology TikTok brain. Everyone is just like, I've got 10 seconds, and if you've not got me in them first 2, I'm on to the next thing. Yeah. Has that sort of like transferred into like students and stuff? Have you noticed like attention spans or anything be less?
Not specifically. I was thinking about this the other day for some reason. I can't remember what prompted it, but something I have observed, and this I don't think is to do with sort of attention so much, but I think our younger generation, and this isn't a criticism by any means, I think are more selective. They know, okay, this is important for me to focus on. I'm going to focus. This is peripheral. I'm not going to focus on this. So I don't think it's an attention capacity issue. I think it's more they just have a better understanding about what it is they're interested in, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if you've got a whole curriculum of things that you want them to be interested in, that can be more challenging. So I think it's a more selective type of engagement, is how I describe it. I don't have any scientific evidence to suggest it to kind of back that up, but that's what I kind of observe.
It makes sense, though, because obviously I have no scientific evidence to back it up, but you think that and it probably comes back to technology and social media, the fact that you can choose what you see the majority of the time. So I remember back in the day, like when social media wasn't as like prevalent as it is now, we was just like you said, it's mass consumption. You mentioned it before. It's sort of you'll sit and watch TV and you'll watch what's on. You watch what like your dad likes, your mum likes, or your grandparents like. Cash in the attic, deal with it. You know, not watching that anymore. But like, so that's interesting. I've never that you just sort of like twigged that together, and then you think about that. It probably is a positive because people are more focused into it separates the wheat from the shaft on it sort of thing. In a way, I imagine it can go quite opposite quite quick. But
it could do. I mean, people then might become more selective in their interests, which again doesn't always have to be a bad thing, but. Yeah, it's interesting. But if you've grown up in an environment where you have had your preferential things that you've engaged in because of the fact that you've had that personalised thing feeding you, then you are going to probably just have those more selective kinds of preferences and attention to that. So it's a really interesting kind of thought.
And like I said, again, just obviously prior to sitting down with you now and just obviously the time we spent, it's sort of got the cogs ticking for me and sort of like, like not the... I will admit that sometimes I probably give social media and technology a harder flat than it probably deserves, but I think that's because I'm not the best with it, and I feel like that's probably me projecting my, like in a relationship with it. But then to hear, obviously, someone who has all this data and information and sort of lives in it is like, it's good to have that reassurance that it isn't this terrible thing, I think.
No, it doesn't have to be. I mean, there's the question about technology companies and how ethical they are in the design of products, and obviously there's big kind of conversations around that at the moment in terms of the online safety sort of stuff, and that in itself can be an issue. But actually it is about, platforms themselves might be designed to be addictive, but that doesn't mean you need to be addicted to it. Because as you said, you have your own kind of experiences of it, and I'm very much an advocate for a user-centered understanding of these things. And actually, if you can understand the user, and that actually as users we do have agency in this, we can determine our own behaviors, and actually a lot of it is to do with that self-awareness. So I'd be a big advocate for knowing more about why people are using and asking those sorts of questions rather than just how much are people using it, because I just think that's a more interesting question.
Have you ever come across the app? It's called 1 Sec, and I installed it on my phone, and game changer. Like
Okay, what
it's
is it?
terrifying. So it is terrible. It's one of the metric ones again. So what it does is, so you can set it to certain apps. So mine was predominantly social media. Especially when I'm doing this, I was trying to stop myself from getting just on it. And what it does when you click the app, it creates a shortcut on your phone, and it makes you, it like does a screen of a deep breath, and then like an inhale and an exhale, and then it says, "Are you sure you want to continue?" And it gives you the option to do it. And I think I saved about 2 days worth of consumption, like because it obviously it registers when you're on, and it registers when you say no, and it says like how many times it stopped you and how many hours it saved you.
Wow.
I'll send it you after. I'll send it you. But
I mean, that's the brilliant kind of stuff.
yeah. And like it's one of them that you can get a paid version, which makes it more user friendly. But like eventually for me, it was like I'd got into the habit of learning how to like negate it, and I was like, oh, right, I'll just
work anymore.
yeah. I was like, second, I'll like put it down. Like, oh mate, Instagram's ready now. So, but like when I used it and I was sort of thoughtful and reflective of using it, brilliant. It was so good because it literally does just like when you're doing, you was mentioning before about just scrolling and just that. Is it digital trace? Did you?
Digital trace is about how. Yeah, that's probably something different.
Yeah. It's like instead of me just picking my phone up and just like subconsciously going onto an app just for like maybe me and Rosh or just boredom, it'd just be like, oh yeah, and it sort of break that habit. And I am better. I've sort of put it down a bit more because with my other business, not business, but my other work and the time of year with students coming back, it's been very busy. So I've took it off, but I am seeing the difference and I am better with that. But I was just wondering if you would ever come across it before.
I haven't. So again, I've learned something else today. So
I'll send you
things I'm good to now follow.
Yeah. So again, maybe it's something that it's one of them parental guidance things, and trying to have like safety online. I think that would be such a good tool if it was there for sort of.
Well, it's about self-regulation, and essentially a lot of it comes down to just if we have better self-regulation on these things, they don't have to be harmful.
Yeah.
And not just about how much you're using it, but what you're engaging in, and self-curating as well. People say, oh yeah, Instagram's terrible because people get body image issues. It's like, well, you wouldn't do if you don't follow people. Who are fitness experts or whatever. My Instagram's full of pages of dogs and landscapes and things because those are the people I choose to follow, and I'm being selective of that. So there's always this kind of big kind of claim about it's there's all these harms. It's like, well, but actually we have agency to work and create this and curate it in a way that's around our preferences and things. So
it's like design. You sort of, for lack of a better term, but there's a phrase in like building your own prison, and sort of the way you do it 100%. Is that you can have a very nice space and then do that. Or I think it's from the it's like an analogy of a zoo with pandas. There was one where it was like in a concrete jungle and they were miserable, and then they built one and it was like it sort of matched their habitat and they were dead happy and nothing. And like that's sort of what we should be doing with social media. But it's interesting. Well, I always ask 2 questions, like the same 2 questions essentially with a different twist, and you've just segued into that mentioning with your Instagram. So what are like, don't have to be 3, but I always try and get 3 out of people. What are 3 habits that you would recommend to people? It can be around cyber psychology, social media use, or it can just be everyday habits. It doesn't have to be niche. You can take a pick of whatever, but what you do and what you feel has like a benefit to your life.
I think that kind of being self-selective, actually. So using that kind of Instagram as an example, just recognizing that actually I do have agency and ability to have positive experiences with using social media from being self-selective. And I am quite ruthless when it comes to culling people as well. If I've not interacted with somebody and that's, friendships and things, if, they dwindle, I will be very self-selective on that. And just recognizing that my energy is only finite, and I am very self-selective of who I engage with, and even in the physical world, social engagements, I am an introvert, so I need to expend my energy in a very sensible way. So very self-selective in lots of different ways. That really does mean that I can feel healthy and optimal. Other things is I suppose, kind of bring it back to the academic context, is having an identity beyond being an academic. It's very easy as an academic for your work and home life to kind of bleed together. So making sure that boundaries are really clear. And the way I do that is from having leisure activities that are very involved, where I physically cannot be doing work in an evening when I'm doing that. So that keeps not only my kind of work and life separate as many ways as possible, but also my boundaries and time and identity being different and not feeling like I'm just an academic and that's it. That's important. Can I get a third
The
one?
third, everyone, or the third, I think one person's like fired 3 out, and I've done like 26 now, and everyone gets the third.
I mean, I'm competitive now. I've got to get a third one.
Well, what I can do is, the next question might inspire your third one, so if we go, and then we'll address that. And you could include or reintroduce one habit or routine into your life that you've never done and want to do, or have done and stopped doing. What would that one be and why?
I think I'd like to have more time or just more routine or regular reading. Even though I'm academic, I don't think I spend enough time reading, whether it's leisurely or work, to be honest. I do read, obviously, but I don't think I read enough. I tend to read in a very pragmatic way. It's like I need to know about this to be able to write about this. Whereas not just reading widely for the intellectual pursuit of doing that. Something I started doing, and it was just before lockdown, is actually going and working in different libraries around the local areas. So like Liverpool Library, which is just beautiful, and all these in the one in Manchester, John whoever's library, that was beautiful. And just being around books, because that's just, I mean, again, I'm a geek, but it was just lovely. And I'd spend a bit of time during there just sitting down and reading a book, and that was lovely. But then the pandemic hit and I kind of got out of that a bit. But I'd like to be able to do that more, I think.
I love reading. That's one of my three. I think it's so meditative as well, especially if you're doing it in, when you're reading like I said, the pursuit of knowledge and things, it's a bit more sort of switched on. But I found that I have to have both now, because I was very much like non-fiction. I was reading that before bed, and it was sort of Audible and it became consuming, and I sort of lost my passion for it because it felt more of a chore. But then when I included fiction as something that was some of them are very complicated, and you have to remember stuff. But like when you can sort of go into that state of, you go into that world, and it's a very different sort of entertainment and way to switch your brain off. But reading has that prompted a third?
It's a different thing, but it's just walking. I do enjoy walking, and that was something actually I developed as a habit from the pandemic. When we were allowed to go out for our one walk a day.
We've let off our leash for a day.
Like I'm allowed out. I got in the habit of going out every day, and actually that has been a really good habit I've managed to keep up broadly. I do tend to walk, even if it's just a couple of miles every day. And that's nice, and it's good for a screen break as well.
And when you're outdoors, I think you get a lot of inspiration of thought as well.
It's really helpful. I find I sometimes come up with my best ideas when I'm walking, and then can't write them down anywhere. But it's good to kind of, it does sort of break down things a lot.
Like shower thoughts. You always have your best ideas in showering. I can't write anything down. It's one of them things. Like you look at all sort of philosophers and stoics from thousands and thousands of years ago, and they're always like, get outside and walk. Get outside and walk, and your best ideas will come.
That's true. So that would be my third.
3. You got them. You got that, mate. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was super insightful, and I've definitely learned a lot, and my maybe perception of technology and social media has changed slightly, and more of a positive light. And I mean, let people know where they can find you if you want to do that. Obviously, I know you've got the sound doctor and things like that, so feel free to do a plug and then.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. No, it's been really nice talking to you. So I'm around on LinkedIn, so if you just search for Professor Linda Kaye. I also have a website called The Cyber Doctor, so you can find loads of stuff on there. I'm also on Twitter / I can't bring myself to call it X.
No one can.
Nobody can.
Nobody
I
can.
still use the old logo.
And literally, that's one of them things you was talking about before you wake up. It's got a new owner and the new name. You're like, what is this? What's this on my phone? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's that as well. I'm on Twitter as well. So yes, always very happy to connect, and no, I've really enjoyed today.
Thank you
for
so much for
inviting
your time. No, it was honestly really good, and I'll put all that information in the description of the podcast.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, how was it?
Good. That was great. You're very good at